Hi, for this session, we'll be setting up a new SQL Server 2006 server running on Windows Server 2016 to support various different applications that we will be adding over time to the environment. As I mentioned in some of the previous videos, we will be slowly adding more and more complexity to this new network and adding additional services and features as time go on. What we're on is a brand new VM that has been deployed to the network. It has been given a name of SQL1, and it has already been joined to the domain. Outside of that, nothing else has been done on the server. So this server has a 60 gig boot drive, and then it has several additional drives that have not been formatted or utilized for any purposes yet. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to go ahead and format the additional hard drives that are attached to the system so we can be prepared for accepting SQL Server. So to do that, you can go ahead and open up disk management. And you can get to that a number of ways. You can right click on the start menu and go to disk management that way. Or you can hit the search and start typing disk management. It should find it. So you can get to a number of different ways. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're going to do, you can configure your disk in a number of different ways. So depending on where your SQL Server is hosted and how your disk situation is, you may want to configure it and format it traditionally, like using disk management, or you can combine this into a storage space, and then you can get higher performance and throughput. So for my purposes, I'm going to format it through here, since in reality, for my environment at least, if I put these in, say, storage space and then create virtual disks off of that, I really won't get much benefit since they're physically on the same spindles, and so I won't really get that much of benefit by doing that. But I do get like virtual management and expansion. That's a little bit better than what you get with the traditional disk management way. I'm going to keep it simple for this, and maybe in another later video I'll show leveraging storage spaces for configuring this. So what we're going to do here in Disk Manager, we're going to go ahead and right click and initialize the disk. And in your case, your disk may have already been offline, so you have to turn the disk from offline if this was a brand new disk that hasn't been touched. Prior to this, I already had turned this one online. I'm going to leave that at GPT and say OK. Now I want to do a new simple value. I'm going to say next on that first one. I'm going to go ahead and use the maximal size, and I'm going to go ahead and use that default drive letter. And for this, I'm going to name this drive volume label of apps. I'm going to perform a quick format. But one change I want to do, I want to change the allocation unit size. I'm going to change that to 64K. And the reason for that is that the way that SQL writes data, you get a little bit better performance by aligning to 64K on the disk for the allocation unit size. So I'm going to do that for all of my disks. And say finish. So now I just want to go through and do that exact same thing for my other two disks that I have mounted. So I'm going to go ahead, turn that online. Then I'm going to right click again, initialize GPT disk, right click, new simple volume, next, and use that same drive letter, next again, change to 64K. And I'll call this one data. Go next, finish. So go ahead, go through and format, and one more time, initialize GPT, new simple volume, next. I'll go ahead and use that default letter of G, 64K, and I'll name this blog. So for SQL, technically this is not enough disks, but for my purposes, for this small lab environment, this is much separation I'm going to do. I'm going to separate my data, I'm going to separate my logs, and then I'm going to have a disk where I can put apps at. Ideally, I should have another place where I can store backup. I should have another place where I can maybe store my temp DB and separate all those pieces out. But for this, I'm not going to do that. I only provision the 3 disks, and we'll leave it at that. As you get into more and more complex SQL environments and environments that's going to scale much, much larger, you definitely probably want to start doing some of those things, as well as maybe considering if you're deploying like a SQL Server into like Azure or AWS or some other cloud, as opposed to using this method, you would probably want to use storage spaces and configure like a simple volumes. That way you can get the maximum throughput for the available virtual disk that you're assigning to the virtual machine. Because normally, I think that probably on all of the cloud providers, they have some level of redundancy underneath on the disk. You doing that within the VM may not really be necessary, since the platform itself has some redundancy built in. What you'll do, you can aggregate the performance of your virtual disk by assigning multiple of them to a storage space, and then building your disk on top of that storage space containing all of those virtual disks, so you can get better performance. But again, that's beyond the scope of this particular discussion, so I won't go into any more details on that. All right, so we have our 3 disks configured. So now what we want to do, we're going to go ahead and if you haven't already, you want to go ahead and insert your media for SQL Server 2016, which I've already done. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. We should go ahead and launch the setup for that. So that may take a few seconds, or maybe a few minutes sometime to fully load that up. So that's starting to load. All right, so that's going to bring us to SQL Server Installation Center. And again, for this setup, I'm not doing a whole lot of the best practices. I'm not building this to be highly available. This will be a standalone SQL instance, at least for right now. Later, maybe down the line, we may deploy a clustered instance or a SQL Server failover cluster instance, or always on availability groups, and those other high availability scenarios that you can configure for this. But for this first go at it, we're going to just do a basic SQL Server installation, and that'll be standalone. All right, so I'm going to just go ahead with the installation. So the installation will do various different prerequisite checks, and it will let me know if I'm deficient in any of those areas. So I'm going to skip past like a lot of this here. So there's a lot of documentation and details here on hardware and software requirements, et cetera, here that you can read through at a later time. I'm just going to go to installation. I'm going to do a new SQL Server standalone installation. Go ahead and launch that wizard. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this one down for now, and we'll go ahead and continue on that. So that's product key there. I'm going to say next. I'm going to go ahead and agree to the licensing terms. Go ahead and say next. So it's going to go ahead and do a couple checks. So if you want, at this point, you can check the box here to allow it to go out to Microsoft Update and check for any updates available for the version of SQL that you have. I believe this media that I'm using is SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, I believe. There are more updates available beyond that that you can deploy at a later date, or you can have the checkbox here go and try to pull some of those updates now. For my purpose, I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and say next. And then it failed for searching for updates. Reason for that, this server is not connected to the internet, so that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and click next past that. If you do have connectivity to the internet, you probably won't see this message here. And now the setup will just go through and install some of the setup files if needed. So if I was installing this from a remote media, it may have went through that, took a little bit longer on that step. So look, I'm getting a few warnings. So computer.net application. So just tell me, hey, couldn't access the internet, which is okay, that's fine. And then it's telling me some warnings about the Windows firewall. So after this is initially enabled, some of the ports that I'll need to access the SQL Server remotely may not necessarily be open. So I may have to go and read this article and open up the appropriate port, so any applications that I point toward the SQL Server can access the server. So I'll just go ahead and say okay to that. Keep that in mind, that we need to do that later, and then I'll go ahead and say next. And now for the purpose of this, there's a few different roles there's a lot of different roles and features that you can install. For my purposes, I want the database engine service. I want full text and semantic extraction for search. I also want the native reporting services feature. And I believe that's all that I will need for now. And one change they have made as far as SQL Server deployment, previously there in previous versions of SQL Server there would be a checkbox to install the management tools for SQL Server, but now those tools are actually bundled separately and is not available during the initial install here. So you have to install those later as far as the management tools. All right, so if you recall, we created three new drives. So for this one, I want to install it on my app drive, which is E. So the C colon here, I'm going to just change that to E for everything here. I'm going to just point everything to E instead of to my C drive. And over here, it's telling me some of the prereqs that it needs. Some of them are already installed. And then there's a few additional ones that will be installed from the media. Go ahead and say next. All right, so now on this screen, I have a few options where I can either I can have a name instance or I can just use the default instance name. So for my purposes, since this is the first instance on this server, I'm going to go ahead and allow it to use the default instance name. Go say next. All right, so now on this screen here, you have some options where you can go ahead and configure various different service accounts. So you can use the default built-in accounts that it has already populated here for me and use those by default, or you can go ahead and specify specific domain accounts to run the various different services on. Benefit of the domain-based accounts, then you can kind of audit and track the usage of those accounts, and then you can kind of manage the passwords and things like that per your domain policy. For the purpose of this, to keep it simpler and quicker, I'm actually going to just leave it at everything at the default. And other thing here, you can grant the server here at creation time permission to do value maintenance tasks. And what this does, when you check this box, it allows the server to instantly initialize files much faster. So without that checkbox, what will happen, whenever you need to initialize a new file, it will have to zero those files out. That is more secure to do that, but it does take a lot more time. Since this is, in my case, this is a more isolated environment just for my lab environment and really just for me, I'm going to go ahead and grant those permissions so I can get the little bit performance boost and not have to wait for pages to be fully zeroed out before I can use them for the applications. And then for collation, we have a collation tab. I'm going to go ahead and leave that as the default settings. Depending on your application that you'll be using with SQL Server, you may need to change this to match what your application support. But for my purposes, this is fine for the things that I'm intending to deploy on here. All right, we'll go ahead and say next. So now in this database engine configuration screen, we have an option where we can configure, okay, who is going to be a SQL Server administrator on the system. We can add users and groups there. And then we can say if we're going to allow Windows authentication mode only, or if we're going to have mixed mode authentication. So what that means on Windows authentication mode only, that means we can only use like either domain-based account or local Windows Server accounts to log into the system. And then mixed mode means that we can use those Windows authentication mode accounts that we mentioned, but you also can use something that we call SQL Server authentication, which is an account that you specify directly on SQL that can have various different rights. For my purposes, and then since most of my applications that I have planned for this, at least right now, they only need Windows authentication mode. So I'll, for now, we'll just leave it at Windows authentication mode. But we can always change this at a later date if I later need to add an application that needs mixed mode. All right. And then for SQL Server administrators, I'm going to go ahead and add my current user. And then I'm also going to add another domain-based group that I created in order to allow that group to be authoritative on this SQL Server instance. So I'll just go ahead and click Add. That'll bring me to the wizard where I can search my domain for various different accounts. So I believe I made my account SQL Administrator, again, keeping it simple. So I have a group named SQL Administrators that I can add various different users into that group, and then anyone that's a member of that group will be effectively a SQL Server Administrator on this server. And we'll go over to data directories. So recall, we have those three drives. So now this is where we kind of want to start separating those things out. So data root directory, I don't remember what drive letter that was for data. So F. So I'm gonna go ahead and just type F. User database, I'll use that. I'll put that on the same folder. Then log drive, database log directory. That was G. So we go ahead and say G. And currently I don't have a backup directory drive. So I'll probably want to change that at a later date or add that in. But for right now, I'll just go ahead and leave it at, well, actually let's point it to E for now. And then at a later date, we can kind of maybe add a real backup directory or a local backup drive where we can store any backups that we need to perform. Then over to tempdb. So by default, it's going to go ahead and configure tempdb based on what it sees my hardware is. So this is a newer feature that's in, I think, starting in maybe SQL 2014-ish when they started this. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. But so what you could do, you can kind of separate the tempdb files out, and you can get a little bit better performance based on how many cores that's in the system, how your disks are laid out. You can get a little bit better performance by doing that. And then also you can have a various different size for the tempdb. So I'm going to make mine a little bit bigger. Actually, I'll just leave everything in default. I'll just leave it as is. I may need a little bit bigger as this environment starts scaling. But again, this is something that you can always change later. So I'll go ahead and leave those defaults. And it is going to my F drive, which again, that's not ideal. Typically, you want to separate out where your tempdb files are versus where you're going to store user database files. So you can get a little bit better performance by isolating those different workload patterns to different physical disks. Be them SSDs or NVMe drives or regular spinning hard drives, spinning rest hard drives. You kind of want to try to isolate and separate those different I/O patterns out. But in the case of like if you're connected to a very large SAN or some type of scale out file server or something like that, that's kind of aggregating all of this. And in that case, it doesn't make that big of a difference because physically, all the drives may be physically on all the same spindles, so they're going to be sharing I/O anyway. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say next. And for this, for reported service native mode, I'm going to allow it to install and configure the instance. I'm going to go ahead and allow it to do that. Say next again. And then one cool thing about this is that, so all those settings and everything that I just selected, for example, all that will get dumped to this configuration file in this path here. So if I wanted to configure another SQL Server with these same exact settings, for the most part, I can do another SQL Server installation and then point it to this configuration file, and that'll allow me to do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and copy that file out. I'm going to just copy it from that location that is indicating there. I'm just going to copy that. And then I'm just gonna store it in another I'll just store it on my root C drive for now, just so I can reference or use it later. All right, so go ahead and say install. And now this will take several minutes to install typically. So we're gonna go ahead and let this go through its steps and getting everything up and going. And if everything goes well, at the end of it, we should have a working SQL Server 26 server ready and available to accept applications. All right, so that looked like that ran successfully, got all success across the board. So we should be all good. So I'm gonna go ahead and close out of that wizard. Then if I click on my start menu, you should see that we have several new icons here. So several recently added administrative tools and pieces for SQL Server. So you actually even see some pieces for SQL Server 2008 got installed. So that installation center is actually from SQL Server 2008 apparently. And then we got SQL Server 2016. We can see our reporting service configuration manager for SQL itself. And then a few other options here for importing and exporting data, looking at errors and usage reporting. as well as the SQL Server 2016 Installation Center, so we can install additional components of SQL Server or install additional instances on the same server. So for now, we're going to go ahead and click on SQL Server 2016 Configuration Manager. And once this MMC open, we can see if we go SQL Server Services, we can see all the services that were deployed and if they're running or not. So you can see that our SQL Server instance is running, our reporting server instance is running as well. So we're in good shape there. And we see the SQL Server agent and browser, neither one of those are currently running. They will manually start and stop as needed for those. So look like we're in good shape. And now the only other pieces that we're missing, as I mentioned, the management tool pieces of SQL Server is not installed during the server installation anymore. It's not an option, so you have to do that as a separate install. So you see here back on the SQL Server Installation Center and the installation section, we have this install SQL Server management tools. So we can go ahead and click that. And what that'll do, this server does not have access to the internet right now, but what that'll do, that'll go out to the internet and try and give you a link to download the latest SQL Server Management Studio tools. But on this server, it's going to fail since I don't have, this server can't access the internet. It has no connectivity out. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window out. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and copy the SQL Server Management tools over from a different server that does have connectivity to the internet and copy it over to this server, and then we'll launch the installation for that and install those tools. Alright, so I went ahead and copied those files over. So we have the SMS installation here, so we're going to go ahead and double click on it to kick off the installation and close down out of some of these other windows. Alright, so go ahead and click install to install the tool. So that'll go ahead and go through and install all of the prerequisite for the SQL Server Management Studio as well as the SQL Server Management Studio components as well. So that'll take a few minutes to install. So I'll just go ahead and let that run through. So that's installed successfully, so I'll go ahead and say close. And then we're going to go click back on the Start menu. So on the Start menu, we'll go back over to that SQL Server 2016 folder, expand that out. And now we see we have a few other more options than we had before. So the one we want to go into is Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So that'll take a few seconds to load up. Alright, so once that loads up, what we can do here, we can go ahead and connect to that instance. So by default, it's going to go ahead and populate the name of the local server name. But if you have multiple instances on the server, they should appear in the drop down here, or you can say browse for more to go and try to find those instances. My case, I only have the one, and I'm going to connect through Windows Authentication. So what that'll do, that'll just go ahead and pass through my currently logged in credentials to the instance. But you see there's a couple different other supported options available. So Active Directory Universal Authentication, Password Authentication, Active Directory Integrated Authentication, SQL Server Authentication. So various different options there. I'll just leave it at Windows Authentication and hit connect. And there we go. So now we're connected to my new SQL Server 2016 instance. I can see my system databases and things that are there by default, as well as those report server databases that were automatically configured and deployed for me since I checked that checkbox to install as well as configure the report server instance. All right, so hope this has been useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.